Well, good evening and welcome to our program, An Introduction to the Nebraska Water Center. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Peggy Althorpe, and I am currently working with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program as an AmeriCorps. Conservation Nebraska is a statewide nonprofit that is dedicated to keeping our natural resources healthy. And one of the main ways we do that is through educational programs like the one that we are co-sponsoring this evening with the Nebraska Water Center. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind you that your cameras are off and you are muted. We are going to be asking a few questions, and we would appreciate it if you could put your responses in the chat room. And then if you have questions that you would like to ask, put those in the Q&A. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Ann Briggs. Ann is the Public Relations and Engagement Coordinator for the Nebraska Water Center. She has her bachelor's degree in Fisheries and Wildlife from UNL, and she has her master's in Human Dimensions of Natural Resources from UNL. After what seems like many interesting work and educational experiences, she's decided to focus on scientific communication, so that she could make scientific concepts more understandable for the general public. So I appreciate you doing that, and I'm sure some of our other participants do as well. So I will turn the program over to Ann, and we will respond to your questions at various times during the program after we've covered certain topics. So again, thank you for being here.
Absolutely, Peggy. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining in with us tonight. We're excited to start this series with Conservation Nebraska. We're planning one webinar a month for the next several months, diving into some hot topics and big challenges in Nebraska water. So I'd like to start tonight just by introducing what the Water Center is, what we do, and some of these big topics. So I'm going to pull up my slides. If you give me just 1 second. Can you see the slides okay? I'm going to take that silence as a yes. Please stop me if you can't see the slides. So like Peggy said, we're going to start with a question for the audience. I want to hear, what's the first thing you think of when it comes to Nebraska's water? This could be anything at all. What's top of mind for you with water in Nebraska? Give you a few seconds to put your information in the chat. I see pollution, runoff, hardness, and nitrates. That's a great point, Carrie. More water crosses Nebraska than any other state. We have the Platte River and drought. Okay. It's like you guys have already seen my presentation. These are all the topics we're going to be discussing tonight. So thank you for your engagement already, and I hope we can provide some information that is relevant to your experience with water in Nebraska and also teaches you a bit more about some of the specific things that we're working on. I can get to the next slide. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Nebraska Water Center if you haven't heard of us before, if you don't know what we do. So we are one of 54 state water research centers. We were established in 1964, and we're tied to the land-grant university, which in Nebraska is the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So every land-grant university has a water center, and our purpose is to share research, support research and education, to help new scientists, and to train future water professionals. So really we can bring the pillars down to research and outreach and education. Those are our focus areas across the board and the things that we try to really help bring to the state. We do this through a variety of means. So we use both traditional and digital media to focus on the communication, education, and outreach. We have a quarterly newsletter that comes out in a print form that we also share online. And then we have various in-person events. Some are geared towards the general public, some are geared towards water managers. So one of our popular events is the water tour that we hold almost every summer. COVID kind of put a pause on that. But we take people who are interested in these resources out into the area that we're discussing to get some boots on the ground and to really understand the water systems that we're interacting with. So for summer of 2023, we're planning to head up to Northeast Nebraska. We'll have a lot of water quality talk as well as infrastructure, since there's a lot of dams that have been built in that area of the state. And it should be a really interesting time for an in-person event to get out of the classroom into the field to really see these things in person. We also hold conferences and seminars. So obviously there's events like this one you're attending tonight where we partner with other organizations, but we also hold a spring seminar series every year as a class through the university that's open to the general public. Our theme this year is Hot Topics in Nebraska Water. So similar to tonight, we'll be hitting on the big issues that the state is facing, but really diving into the research in those areas and seeing what's currently being done and what is the need for the future. We also hold a water conference every year. So it's about a 3-day in-person event. And for the past few years, we've been tracing the Platte River. So we went from Scottsbluff to Kearney. Next year we'll be in Omaha to really understand how the river system works throughout the state. We also do different symposiums and research symposiums, depending on what our partners are interested in hearing. As I've touched on research just a little bit, we are proud to not only support research in the state, but also to own some of the research that's going on. So our water sciences laboratory is a great tool. They're not only a state leader, but a nationwide leader when it comes to mostly water quality research, but a lot of other types of research they do as well, whether it's supporting the natural resource districts with testing their water or creating new methodology to address the upcoming issues. The Water Sciences Laboratory is all over it. Since we are funded by the United States Geological Survey, we also offer grants to researchers in the university system. The number of grants depends on the year, but we support their ideas in water research and help new research to happen that really benefits the state, happens in the state, and will go directly from our researchers to the farmers and the resource managers who will use that information. And the last research that I'd like to highlight is we are part of the Dougherty Water for Food Institute, which you may or may not have heard of. Their focus is on securing water for the future with the purpose of feeding a growing population. So there's a lot of space for research in that area that's exciting to Nebraska, but also for the rest of the world. And as Nebraska is such a food production, agricultural based state, it's really interesting to apply our research and resources to the greater world as we're looking to fight hunger in the future. So another way that we do education, outreach, and research is through facilitating partnerships. One of the great opportunities being part of the university system, but not a department within the university, is that we can connect faculties to the statewide water partners. So bringing a researcher straight to the natural resource district that has a challenge that they have expertise in addressing, and even bringing together panels to decide what are the issues in the state, what should we be focusing on, and how can we actually make a difference now and in the future with the research that's being done. So these are some of the partners that we've worked with in the past and the present, and this isn't an exhaustive list. The great thing about being the Water Center is we are open to collaborating with anyone who has a project and an idea and is wanting to address water in this state. So now that I've given you a bit of a quick run through of what the Nebraska Water Center is and what we do, I'd like to introduce the 3 topics that we'll be focusing on in this webinar series. So we have water quality, water quantity, and climate change. And each of these topics, I'll give you a rundown tonight of some of the top level base information that you need to know. And then in the next few months, we'll have a webinar specifically on each of these topics from a leading expert in the field to get really deep into this area and get the specific information to you. So we're going to start with water quality, which is something that a lot of you put into the chat as something you think of first when it comes to water in Nebraska. Now, obviously, all the water in the state is connected, but I do like to differentiate a little bit between urban water quality issues and rural water quality issues. They do interact with each other, but they do have some unique challenges as well. In urban areas of the state, something that is coming up is emerging contaminants. So these are new contaminants that we've discovered in the past few years to be either more present or more harmful than was previously thought. So PFAS, antibiotics, hormones, pharmaceuticals, and microplastics are some of the top things of mind, not only for Nebraska, but for the rest of the country and even the rest of the world. And I have a little graphic here about PFAS. That's something that's going to come up in the news and in the research in the next few years. So I thought I'd touch on it briefly. But they're known as forever chemicals. So they don't break down like other chemicals do. They have really strong bonds. And so it's very challenging to get them out of water or out of even your body once they're in there. And the other challenge with PFAS is that it builds up over time. So if you are cooking on a nonstick surface that has PFAS in it and eating off of it every single day, it's going to build up in your body over time. So we have researchers working to address how do we break down these forever chemicals, these PFAS, and how do we make products that perform just as well without the harmful chemicals. So that's something to look out for in the future with research coming out on PFAS and what we're doing to improve that situation. As we're talking about the state as a whole, but kind of getting into the rural water quality issues, we can break our water resources into groundwater, lakes, and streams, and they're all connected. But this graphic gives you an example of the different chemicals and the different things found in our water resources. So, for example, 92% of the groundwater in the state has nitrate in it, and 30% of the lakes in the state have mercury. So these things on their own are not an issue. These things at low levels are not harmful, but when you get to really high concentrations, that's when it's an issue. For example, Nebraska Game and Parks might close a lake if there is an algae bloom that's harmful to human health. Or we might have water quality notices in rural areas when their nitrate gets too high, and even with uranium and arsenic. So I see a question, where does lead fall? I believe, I'm not a water scientist, I'm a science communicator, but my understanding is that lead is a heavy metal similar to uranium and arsenic. So lead could be in all three, but it's probably more likely to be found in our groundwater. And that's a good point that all of these systems, groundwater, lakes, and streams, are connected. They do interact with each other, but some contaminants are more common in some spaces than others. What is AmeriCorps? That's a great question. My researcher put this slide together for me, so I'm not really sure, but I can look it up for you. So something that a few people put into the chat as the first thing that comes to their mind is nitrate. And that's something I want to dive into a little bit tonight, since there has been nitrate in the news recently. You might have seen some of these news articles or other ones talking about how a lot of the groundwater in the state has nitrate in it, which gets into the drinking water, which causes other problems. So I'll just give you some basic information on these different things, and then we can get into some questions if you have them. So nitrate is a form of nitrogen. Nitrogen is naturally occurring in the soil, but in Nebraska soil, it's generally at lower levels. So corn needs nitrogen to grow, and farmers will apply nitrogen-based fertilizer to their crop. This is normal. This happens all over the country when in areas that the soils don't have enough nitrogen. But the problem comes when too much nitrogen-based fertilizer is applied to an area and it's more than the corn crop can take up. So some of the nitrogen gets turned into nitrate, which then sits in the soil and it leaches into the groundwater, and it's very hard to get rid of. And some of the impacts of having too much nitrate in your water is it's a health hazard and it also causes economic loss. So the USDA has created a nationwide standard that 10 parts per million is the highest amount of nitrate that can be in your drinking water that's at a safe level. And there's even some talk about reducing this number to say like 5 parts per million is the safe level, depending on the research that's coming out. So really high levels of nitrate in groundwater, which is used for drinking water in a lot of the state, has been linked to health concerns like pediatric cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, and other types of health issues, lifelong health issues. And I have a link here at the bottom of the page for you to look at some more information about nitrate. But it also leads to economic loss for communities. On one hand, they have to pay millions of dollars to treat their drinking water to bring it back to a safe level, whether on a community level or an individual household could pay thousands of dollars to make their drinking water safe through having treatment in their house. But it also impacts the future economic ability of that community. If a community doesn't have healthy drinking water, then industry won't want to come there and people won't want to keep living there. So we're looking at a lifelong issue, not only for people who live there, but for towns as a whole. So we do have some solutions that we're working on. They generally fall into categories of precision management and conservation practices. So being more specific about how you apply nitrogen-based fertilizer makes it less likely that the nitrate will be leached into the groundwater. You can also take care of your soil health and your crop health when there's not crops in the field to ensure that it's less likely to leach and you'll have the proper amount of nitrogen to support the corn growth, but also to not leach into the groundwater. Now, I have been talking a lot about nitrogen coming from agriculture and fertilizer. It does come from some other sources as well. Golf courses and municipal and urban areas using too much fertilizer, same issue. It can't all be picked up by the plant, and so some of it gets into the soil and then to the groundwater. Feedlots have also been seen to leach nitrate through manure that's left sitting, as well as some research on septic tanks that aren't properly sealed can be nitrate leaches as well. So that's why it's been in the news a lot, is because it's a really challenging issue. It's really hard to figure out where it comes from and how it got there. And it stays in the soil for a long time. So if you change your behavior this year, you might not see the benefits for 5 or 10 years, depending on how quickly the groundwater moves in your area of the state. So here's a map of nitrate found in groundwater across the state. Now, before I was talking about parts per million, this map is in milligrams per liters, but it's a similar representation of how much nitrate is in the groundwater. So you can see that across the state, we have some areas that are struggling with this, but it is more specifically focused here in the Platte Valley in the central part of the state, as well as the Brazil area in the northeastern part of the state. Now, this is something, whether there's more agriculture in that area, whether the soil chemistry is different, or even the aquifer moves in a different way and it makes the nitrogen collect differently, our researchers are working on this. But we have identified parts of the state that are more susceptible to this challenge. So I mentioned the aquifer. You probably already know this, but here's a map of the High Plains aquifer that Nebraska and much of the Midwest sits on top of. You'll see that almost all of the state of Nebraska is on top of the High Plains aquifer, which gives us really great access to groundwater and really great opportunity for agriculture and for irrigation-based agriculture. But it also gives us some challenges to address when it comes to these long-term issues like nitrate being found in the groundwater in the soil, that it's bigger than just like one area. It kind of moves around, which makes it more challenging to address. So I'd like to share a bit about how the Water Center is involved in water quality research. This is through, we also do outreach and research in water quality. The first example I have is the Nebraska Nitrate Initiative. So we have coordinated nitrate working groups, a faculty nitrate network, and our purpose really is to identify specific issues in the state, specific areas that need assistance, and then we can match the right faculty member to the right part of the state to get the expertise, to get the local knowledge, and combine them to find really great solutions to this problem. This one isn't necessarily nitrate related, but another water quality program we have is called Know Your Well. It's a citizen science project that involves high school classrooms, trains them to be water scientists. They collect samples, they analyze the data, and they report their findings to the well owners. And their data is also run by our water sciences laboratory. So we have double checks anything that comes up as high concentrations or potentially dangerous. We let the well owners know. So it's a great way for individuals across the state, not only to learn more about water science, but also to get their water tested and see if there's any actions they need to take for the water that they drink every day. I've also mentioned our water sciences laboratory, but I'll shout them out again because they do a great job. They are the leading expert in nitrate testing in the state. This comes from their staff expertise and their specialized equipment. Some of the methodology they use to test nitrate in groundwater that's really unique to this laboratory, but really useful for the research, is they use stable isotopes, they use nitrogen fingerprinting, and they use groundwater age dating. Now, this is all getting very technical with how nitrate works, how water quality is tested, but you're in luck if you come back to our February session, because Dan Snow, the Water Science Laboratory Director, will be presenting on water quality in February. Now, the lab does more than just nitrate testing. They have great facilities. And one of the things that they're really great at is creating new methodology for emerging research that's going on. So they're able to adapt to whatever the current issue is, create really great methods, and then produce research before anybody else has caught up. So to wrap up our water quality section, I have a question for you. So you can put your answers in the chat. Where does nitrate come from? And I did share a couple of examples, so there's a couple of right answers, but that's my learning check question for you. Where does nitrate come from? Great. I see nitrogen, I see fertilizer, golf courses, feedlots, farms. Great. Thank you guys. And I will pause here too and see if there's any other questions I missed about water quality specifically. So I see effects on children as a water quality question when it comes to nitrate. There is lots of research that proves strong linkages between high levels of nitrate in drinking water and cancer, pediatric cancer. Pediatric cancer is of a couple different types, but the common linkage is high levels of nitrate in drinking water. And that's where it comes into the lifelong effects of this water quality issue, is if you've been drinking this water for your whole life and you don't find out until you're 16 that you have some kind of cancer, it's really challenging to go back and address any of the cause because it's a little bit too late. So we do have research. Ellie Rogan with the University of Nebraska Medical Center, UNMC, is one of our leading researchers on pediatric cancer and its relation to nitrate. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I can send a link to her work and to their page specifically with this research. I see another question. How does the Nebraska Water Center interact with the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy, specifically related to the nitrate issue? So that's a good question. We do partner with them. We do interact with them. It's challenging because right now everyone's trying to figure out the best way to manage this issue, if it's research, if it's regulations. And so we're in talks with them now to see how we can support their decision-making process with the best combination of science and outreach. That's kind of a vague answer to your question, I know, but since we're in the midst of it, we are working on it. We're hoping to address it, and we're hoping to partner with the Department of Environment and Energy specifically as we work on this. Let me look at your other questions. Okay, so I see questions about reverse osmosis systems reimbursement. So the only thing that I know that would change is if at the federal level, the safety limit is reduced to 5 parts per million, which hasn't happened yet. It might not formally happen. There's no timeline for when this decision could be made, but it is a conversation that's been had among regulatory agencies and departments. So that's great. That's the thing to look out for, that you might be able to get reimbursed. And I know that there's currently a program. I'm not sure if it's through the natural resource districts or the state of Nebraska, where you can apply to get a reverse osmosis system covered and reimbursed to you if you have water that tests high in nitrate. So Zach, if you're interested in that information, I can send it to you as well.
Anne, I have a couple questions in the Q&A. One of them is, what about Alt-M?
Yep. So is there more context in that question, or just what about, okay, what about
Alt-M.
Yes.
That's probably a program in and of itself, I would guess. But
so Alton is a site in Mead, Nebraska that is a water quality issue, kind of an environmental. People have called it the biggest environmental catastrophe in Nebraska because this plant had a spill basically and contaminated some of the groundwater and surface water. We are involved in the research in that the water sciences lab is leading the sample testing, and the University of Nebraska Medical Center is leading the research that is looking into the health impacts. So we are working on it. That is a great current event in water quality in the state, and something that we're keeping an eye on. We're very involved in, and it's important for us to keep addressing. What about water quality and miscarriages? Again, that goes back to nitrate. There are other issues as well, but I don't think I can say they've been strongly linked, but they have been linked, especially if there are higher levels of nitrate beyond what is considered the 10 parts per million as a safe level. And is Alton contamination getting into Lincoln water? I don't think that's a question that I can answer right now. I don't fully understand the Lincoln water system and where the Alton site is moving to. But I have a resource that gives you all of the updated information on the Alton contamination that's going on. So some of these links I can share in the chat when we're done talking so that you have more information to go into. So I think I will wrap up the water quality section here, and I will come back if you have specific questions. My email's at the end, and I will follow up with some of these specific questions as well. So let me get to my next slide. Thank you guys for being so engaged and involved with these questions. I really appreciate it. We are going to move into water quantity in this state. So that looks like both drought and flooding. Now, these are both pictures of the Platte River. The drought picture is from 2022 in about the Grand Island area, and the flooding picture is from 2019 in about the Omaha area. So same river system, not that far apart, and we have very different conditions going on. So Nebraska is a land of extremes. When it comes to drought, much of the state is susceptible to it. Now this map is from, let me get my reference point to show up. This map is from 2021, I believe. And so 2022 was even worse, even more intense of a drought, specifically in the northeast region of the state and the southwest region of the state. We are at high drought levels, and we'll see what the moisture this winter does to reduce those potentially in the spring as we go into another harvest season. But Nebraska is also a land of extreme flooding. So you can see again, these red areas face extreme risk of riverine flooding specifically. And even some of those areas overlap, like we saw with the Platte River system that we've been talking about. So all along the Platte here, you can trace some of those high risk areas along the Platte River because the Platte does both. And the Platte really is dependent on some of the snowmelt that comes from the Rocky Mountains, as well as rain conditions in Wyoming, Colorado, and Nebraska. So there's a lot of influences that go on with flooding and with drought in Nebraska. But the great thing about Nebraska that we've talked about already is that we have groundwater. We have this aquifer that helps us to be resilient to the flooding and the drought and the flooding and the drought that we go through. So 80% of Nebraskans receive water from groundwater sources. A lot of the groundwater in Nebraska is used for domestic reasons, for drinking water. A lot of the rural parts of the state use groundwater exclusively for drinking water. So that's a good buffer if we do have a drought, that we have an aquifer to rely on. It's also a great opportunity if we have a flood, that some of that water can recharge the aquifer, be soaked back into it, and we can essentially store it for later. But across the state, groundwater levels vary. So you can see in the southwestern corner of the state, in 2022, the groundwater declined a number of feet, but throughout part of central and eastern Nebraska, the groundwater increased. So some of that is due to different soil types. Some of that is due to different usages throughout the state, different pressures put on it by communities or by agriculture. And even though the whole system is linked, there's still different things that happen around the state with the groundwater. So the Water Center is involved in water quantity research. One of the ways specifically is through a partnership with the Dougherty Water for Food Global Institute. Drought really is one of their main focuses, and it allows their faculty fellows who have research focused on flooding and drought to apply those influences to the bigger picture of feeding a larger population and making a more resilient world. And so that's a quick look at water quantity in the state. But in March, if you're interested to hear more, we'll have a speaker in partnership with us, but a staff member at the National Drought Mitigation Center who will get more deeply into the research of drought, flooding, and water quantity in the state as a whole. So I have another question for you, another learning check. What water feature in Nebraska helps the flooding and the drought and the flooding and the drought be less intensely felt by its residents? If you could send your answer in the chat. Okay, great. I'm seeing groundwater. I'm seeing aquifer. We also have things like lakes and dams and Lake McConaughey that have been built as a method to store this water. So great job, everybody. You know your stuff when it comes to water quantity in the state. And I hope you're excited to learn more in our March presentation about this specifically. So I have one more area that I'd like to talk about tonight, which is climate change, which will be the fourth session in our series. So I have a few stats that I'd like to share, and if you're interested in learning more, I have that URL at the bottom of the page. But these are some projections from our climatologist about how climate change could impact Nebraska. So in the past few years, very heavy precipitation events have increased 16% in the Great Plains region. So if you think about this as a whole, we might receive a similar amount of rainfall, except in drought years, those are kind of the exception. But instead of raining 10 times in a 2-month period, it might only rain 3 times, and we have a more intense storm each time. And so again, that leads into the flooding, making it more intense and more common. And so climate change in Nebraska, really, we can relate it back to both water quality and water quantity in the state. We're also looking at projected temperature increase of either 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit if we're working on the low emission scenario, or 8 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit if we're working on the high emission scenario. So that URL at the bottom of the page has resources on this. It has some graphs and charts to help to understand what these different scenarios are like. We're also looking at soil moisture being projected to decrease 5 to 10%. So if you were looking at increased flooding, we're looking at decreased soil moisture, which relates to drought and the drought that we're currently in, which increases our need for irrigation, which decreases our use of the aquifer in the long term. So as you can see, all of these challenges in the state and water in the state really overlap and interconnect with each other, which is why it's such a great place to study water and to research and be engaged, but also makes for some really challenging issues as we try to address all of these things at the same time. We were talking about the Platte River earlier and how the snowpack in the Rocky Mountains impacts the stream flow in our rivers. Excuse me. So if it snows less in the Rocky Mountains, we don't get the spring release that we normally do, and we don't have as much flowing through our river. We already touched on the heavy precipitation, the flood, and the drought. So climate change is kind of the big term picture that we can relate our current challenges to, and kind of the motivation to improve our research and our actions on the current challenges now, so that we're able to adjust to these different climate-related conditions in the future. Some of the ways that the Water Center is involved in climate change in Nebraska is through a partnership with the University of Nebraska Medical Center. They have a new water, climate, and health program, which is working to bring together these different pieces that are so closely related, but are often studied separately. We also have faculty fellows with a research focus on the climate impacts on water specifically. So there are researchers who are digging into this every day. This is their real expertise, and looking to apply this information to the state, to the region, to the country to help combat some of the issues that we're projecting for the future. And in April, if you want to hear more about climate change and how it relates to water in Nebraska, we'll have a presentation by the State Climatology Office in partnership with this seminar series. So a question for you to wrap up our climate change section: how is climate change projected to impact Nebraska? And I provided a couple different examples, so throw out the one that stands out to you if you want to put it into the chat. I see flooding as an impact, soil moisture, great. Heavy precipitation, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And good job, everybody, for remembering those specific stats too. Yes. Great. And I see one question came in about climate change. How does Wyoming cloud seeding affect Nebraska? That's a great question. And I think this research on cloud seeding is really, really interesting. So for those of you who don't know, I'll give my basic rundown. But these researchers in Wyoming are working on how can we kind of plant seeds in clouds to make them snow, so that we have the snowpack that we need high up in the mountains to feed the rivers that connect them. So if there's cloud seeding done in Wyoming that connects to the North Platte River system, then when it melts in the spring, it will flow down to us, to the Platte River, and onto the other water resources that the plat connects to. So if it goes well, it's a great way to kind of buffer. If there's less natural snowfall, they can do some cloud seeding, increase the snowfall, and then keep the spring melt at the same point that we expect it to be. So hopefully that answers your question. And if we don't have any other climate change questions for tonight, I don't think I see any. Okay, I have 2 wrap-up questions as we're tying all these things together. And we've been talking about these, but if you want to throw some of these things into the chat, that would be great. So 2 questions, pick your favorite. What are 3 categories of challenges in Nebraska water? And what does the Nebraska Water Center do? Very open-ended questions. I'd love to hear what your focus is and what your takeaways have been from the conversation we've had tonight. Great answers. Water quality and quantity. The Water Center does research, outreach, and education. We coordinate and facilitate. Were you guys taking notes? Did you write down all my slides as I gave them? These are some great answers. I really appreciate you guys being so engaged tonight and being so involved in the conversation that we've had. That's everything that I have prepared for you. I do have my contact info at the bottom of this screen if some of our conversations sparked more specific questions that you'd like to follow up on. And I do see that in the chat, we have some specific questions that I will send answers to. Research on references on the All-10 communication, the pediatric cancer and nitrates, as well as the reverse osmosis reimbursement program. So I'll go through the chat tonight and make sure that you guys get your answers for that. And then do you mind sharing the first slide again, where you outlined what is found in groundwater, lakes, and rivers? Yes, I can go back to that for you. Yes, back to the beginning. Here you go. Did you have a specific question on that slide, Zach, or just wanting to look at the stats again?
I was wondering, is there anything more you can tell us about pharmaceuticals in the water? Does that have to do with, how people dispose of them and so forth, or?
Yeah, so that would be, some of it could be from most of it's probably improper disposal. So if you had a prescription, you were done with it, but you didn't take all of the pills and you flush it. That's what some people do to get rid of it. And then it stays in the water system. Yeah. So that's, I think, the most common way that pharmaceuticals get into the water. There's other ways as well, but
right. Yeah. Through urine and stuff like that, I'm assuming, or
yeah, and through animal.
Yeah.
If you had feedlots and things like that, that you were feeding them pharmaceuticals through the feed and some of it spilled even, it could get into the water in that way too. And pharmaceuticals are similar to PFAS, where it's just really challenging to remove them because the chemicals are very strongly bound to each other and they're very specifically focused instead of being single nitrogen or oxygen or hydrogen. They're very complex chemicals, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Are there other questions that we aren't answering here? Anne, you did a fantastic job of giving us an overview. We really appreciate it. And I just might remind people, we do have 3 more programs. You talked about all of them, but February 7th will be the water quality in Nebraska. It's kind of a more intense program about that. And then March 14th is another, you're talking more about drought and flooding, I believe. And April 11th is climate change and water in Nebraska. So we'd like to encourage you to look at our website or our Facebook page to get more details about those programs. Okay, so someone, Mike wants to see, oh, you've got that, the groundwater. Okay.
Yes. Let me get, okay, can you guys see the slide again?
Yeah.
Two slides before that. This one?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a link that I can send. If that's more interesting. This is one that I grabbed from a news article that was published a few weeks ago.
Are there any other questions or comments that we're missing? You did a really good job.
Thank you. So I'm going to start sharing some of the links.
Okay.
Some of the questions were asked about. So here's the first one with information about all 10.
Okay. And the recording will be up on the Conservation Nebraska website probably in 2 or 3 weeks. We record all of our webinars. Okay.
I have a link here for the Water, Climate, and Health program. And let me find the information on pediatric cancer as well. So here's a news article that I think is helpful, and then it links out to some of the specific research. That's being done by UNMC.
Okay. The dates for the next webinars are February 7th, and all of them will be at 6:30 in the evening. March 14th and April 11th. Yeah, you've got them. Okay, great.
And I will get, there's one more link for the reverse osmosis system. I'll pull that one up quick. So this is the program that I was referencing. There might be a couple different ones going on right now, but this is the one that I saw in the news. And this is the one that says it's currently taking applications. And with the nitrate specifically, if you are anyone in the state, but if you are a rural resident and you want to know more about the nitrate in your area, going to your natural resource district is the best way to find current information and information that relates to your part of the state specifically. Even if you're in Lincoln, our natural resource district has information on this, but Lincoln goes about it in a different way because our water doesn't come from groundwater, whereas a lot of the more rural parts of the state get their drinking water from groundwater. So it's kind of a different situation. But even just like Googling natural resource districts in Nebraska, you'll get a map and you can help find which one you will live in and which one will have the best information for you. Are there any other questions or links that I can send to people while I have you on here?
Would you be willing to share your email maybe in case people would want to email you with that? You don't mind doing that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It is in the slides, so if you see the recording later on, it's at the very end, but I just sent it in the chat as well. Or you can go to the Water Center's website and find it in our staff list too.
Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, we're leaving a little bit early, but you did a really wonderful job of giving an overview, so we really appreciate that. And here's our feedback survey. If everyone would complete that, it would be very helpful. This is for our grant funding and so forth. I think some people have left, but anyway, if you wouldn't mind taking time, we'd appreciate it. Okay. And
Okay,
thank
well,
you to Sarah McLean, who is the Conservation Nebraska person who's been our Zoom host. I really appreciate her doing that.
well, thank you all for coming tonight. If you're still sticking
Thank you.
around, and I hope to see you in the next few sessions. We'll have some
Right.
experts here to talk about these issues more specifically. So bring your questions, bring the things that you want to learn about, and they'll be able to answer them really well for you.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne.
Mhm.